Good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to see those folks over here who are here. You know, the ones that are still awake and who aren't worn out after all these days of doing things. So I'm hoping I see people are still coming in. So, you know, come in, come in, come in. But it is 9 o'clock, and so I want to make sure that they have all the time they want to in order to go and have their presentations. So I'm actually a volunteer moderator because we couldn't figure out who's supposed to be moderating the session. So I'm up here, and I didn't prepare anything to say about these people, except I've known Gage and Tony for almost forever. So and worked with them on a lot of projects for a lot of years. I was actually thinking about this, last night, that I think I met at least Gage somewhere around 1977 or somewhere around there, 76, 77. I think it was later for Tony. But so I've known these folks for a long time. They've been very active in the whole area. So I'm not going to say anything else because I want to hear what they have to say. So whoever's first.
Okay. Just to add to what Mark said, I was 7 when I started graduate school. Okay. Can folks hear me in the back? No. Yes. Oh, speak up. Wait a second. I got it. How about now? Okay. Technology is very hard for me. Okay. Tony and I are going to talk about a couple ideas this morning, and they revolve around kind of an idea to move adaptive testing a little bit farther forward. And lots of folks have taken shots at moving adaptive testing forward. Vim's done some very good work in moving us to a more consolidated design. But what we're going to talk about is what test blueprints lack and procedures for using a systems-based approach to help adaptive testing move forward. Okay, so what we're talking about today is, first we'll start with aspects of operational adaptive tests that aren't really well represented in blueprints. So that's where we'll start our conversation. Then we'll talk about a few examples specifically related to a couple things where adaptive testing causes a traditional test blueprint to have difficulties. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about the systems-based approach. And finally, we'll talk about something that we're calling dynamic computerized adaptive testing, which is Tony's name. I take no credit for it. And so he will take us through the first portion of this, and I will go sit down.
One of the things that we wanted to do today, besides introduce these topics and talk about them, is to have it be a little bit more interactive session, even though it's a keynote, chance to get everyone a little bit awake, participate, think about your own testing programs or programs you're interested in. So we'll start right away with a question. One of the things that we're going to make sure we discuss in this context, and I haven't heard a lot about it yet this week, is the differences between educational tests and licensure and certification tests. Those seem to be the two major areas where CAT has been applied with any volume, and so they're just slightly different, particularly in regarding the test plans and the way we think about conforming the tests. How many of you deliver or are involved with educational type testing? Okay, it's a little less than half. Licensure and certification testing? Other kinds of testing. All right, good. So that's, yeah, not you, Mark. How many of you are involved in those testing programs that are computer-based? Not thinking about being computer-based, but are currently computer-based? Oh, fantastic. Okay, yeah, excellent. Yeah, I have more questions, but that's okay. We overpacked the session, so you'll forgive us if we kind of are choppy a little bit. Defining test blueprints is the first thing, based on the title of the talk. Oop, did the wrong. Okay, a traditional blueprint for adaptive testing is, it says it's the roadmap for the test. It talks about how many items are on the test, what the test plan, content areas are, other descriptions that give students and other stakeholders ideas of what the test is about. There may be some administration rules in the test blueprint, maybe not. Here's where an immediate difference, though, is between an educational test and a licensure and certification test. In the licensure and certification area, the description of the test actually becomes a legal document and is the basis for the legal defensibility of the exam, and it is the keystone that relates the exam content back through the job task analysis to reflect what it is the candidates need to do on the job and be competent in. In an educational test, it has a similar function, but the weight and importance is a little less so, in that it's not exactly a legal document, but the stakeholders that are involved in educational testing are very interested in exactly what the test is about, what it measures, what it's intended to measure, other aspects of the exam. So it really is no less important. It just doesn't have that little bit of legal feeling that a test blueprint has in the licensure and certification arena. The challenges of blueprints with CATs is, those of you that are invoking computerized adaptive testing for your testing modality realize that a description of the content of the exam really doesn't fulfill the expectation of describing the exam in its entirety. One of the main differences in a paper and pencil exam and a computerized adaptive testing exam is that for a paper exam, if you talk about the content and the item types, you pretty much have described the whole thing because of the very standard way that we give every question to every candidate. Most blueprints, I don't believe, in a paper and pencil world talk about test forms and how we rotate forms and all that, but they really do describe the test and the test content fully. For an adaptive test, there's a number of important parameters that are important in the conduct of the exam that are not specifically explicated in a test blueprint, and some of those are shown above. To assure, if the targeting is maximum information versus the student's ability to get the items correct. How do you handle students that run out of time? We talked a little bit about it yesterday. Students that are in the gray zone and we can't make a decision for. And do they pass or do they fail in the educational context? Or do we want to test them again? In a licensure context, do you give them a license or not? And the easy object is, I'll just keep testing them. Well, computerized adaptive test has a significant set of costs depending on the venue and how the test is being delivered, either in candidate time and stakeholder time or in actual seat time for a licensure exam usually. And so we can't give them infinite testing time. And so we have to figure out how we're going to handle those that are in the gray area when their testing time is completed if they haven't achieved a pass or fail status. Item styles. With the advent of computerized technology, a lot of testing groups are exploring different item types and different response modalities to try to get at more fidelity in the testing interaction. If we're giving an exam that contains a multiplicity of item types, do we want to assure certain item types or certain percentages of item types are given to every candidate? If we think that essays take a lot longer than a multiple choice question, don't we think it's only fair to control the number of essays each candidate has and make that comparable across test takers? How do we control item exposure? In ongoing testing programs, both for education and licensure, the idea of the best items being overused is certainly one that we have to think about and have to control for. How is that done? We need to explain that and decide how to do that. All of these decisions are constraints on the very original adaptive testing models that assumed, target the candidate where they live, get the best information with the best items, and the test is, golden. In operational settings, that really is a fantastic goal, but it's not the way that we are able to test given the operational realities. To meet.
Hey, Tony.
Yes.
Why don't we ask them a little bit about their own experience? How many of you folks are currently delivering an adaptive test? A few. Okay. How many of you would deliver an adaptive test if you could figure out how to deal with some of the issues on the previous slide? Yeah. It seems like as psychometricians, we've done a very good job of establishing a baseline for what adaptive testing should be. But sometimes when we try to move from the theoretical to the practical, we kind of lose our way. And these are just some of the things that cause us to lose our way as we're going along.
I think that's a great point. Like, what are real world constraints that your testing programs live under that are not generally handled elegantly in a traditional CAT model? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The way that we've handled, or the testing programs, operational testing programs have handled these non-blueprint CAT constraints is shown on the slide. We've developed side tools, kind of homegrown solutions to problems that we're having. First example is exposure control. You know, none of the literature that I read growing up talked about item exposure control and how to control for the item usage in an item pool. There's certain well-known procedures that have worked out, but these are still kind of procedures on the side. They're not really integrated well into your adaptive testing system. Each tool, each constraint that is been imposed on adaptive testing has competing priorities, right? Is it more important to have the absolute best measurement at the cut score, or is it more important in your testing program that the items are not overexposed? Well, both. Well, there are different solutions to each one of these problems. Sometimes not all the requirements can be met, and each side tool doesn't really talk to other side tools. So decisions have to be made kind of in an overarching way to determine how to best build the system to balance the way that the tools attack the problem. The other issue with these side tools is they're not very well standardized. The way Simpson header attacks item exposure is very different than the content control thing that Gage and I proposed. Is different than other kinds of exposure control. Some are more complicated, some are less complicated, and each one has a little different feel, a little different impact on the testing program. The first example is, just to pick out a couple examples so that we can see how they act differently, is item exposure. A fixed test blueprint doesn't include information that we need to describe how items are used across testing events. Again, in ongoing testing programs, a single item pool is used for a set of time periods, and then you have to decide what to do for the next set of time periods. Do you reuse the items? Do you have a new item pool? Do you have an item pool that's masked? There's any number of ways to handle exposure, but the idea is that we have to figure out and plan ahead of time what that is. Adaptive testers have had to build procedures to control item exposures in ways that allow for item usage, the best items to be used as much as possible, but not overused. The issue is, depending on your item pool design and your item pool robustness, taking out the best items and holding them because of exposure issues might cause blueprint violations. How do you handle that? Do you give less informative items? Do you stop the testing? I mean, probably not, but these are issues that have to be decided by the psychometricians that are working with the stakeholders on these testing programs. Almost all licensure and certification programs invoke an exposure control element in some way, shape, or form. For educational tests, this is not uniformly as true, as Gage might point out. NWEA, which does millions of tests all over the country, doesn't worry about item exposure.
Yeah, it's important to realize that we've talked a lot about item exposure over the past couple decades, and commonly what we really talk about when we're talking about item exposure is something else. We worry about item exposure because we worry about the validity of our test scores, or we worry about the possibility of cheating or pre-knowledge helping particular individuals do well on the test when they shouldn't. So I think the, if you're working in a low stakes environment, if you're working in an environment with a very large item pool, you may not be as worried about applying something like Simpson header in advance. If you're working in an environment in which you continuously publish items and add them to the item pool, rather than having a block of items that goes out at a particular time, side tools like Simpson header aren't as useful because they require a pre-analysis that can't easily be done if you're working in a situation in which you are constantly adding items.
The next example that is becoming more important as item writing technology is improving and item writers are getting more clever is item styles. The standard total multiple choice test for measuring a construct or a person's ability to enter a occupational field is changing before our very eyes. I've been involved with a couple projects that they've called the next gen. So we worked on the next generation GMAT and built a set of item styles for their integrated reasoning subtest, a whole new construct that they're looking at. Right now we're in the middle of a project for NCSBN, and they're working at the next generation NCLEX to build items that measure clinical judgment in a way different than the multiple choice item does. So as the sophistication of the testing programs increases, the probability of having to deal with different item styles is increased. One of the challenges of introducing new item styles is how do you do that? If you have an existing multiple choice test and you want to start seeding in, let's say, constructed response items to measure students in a different way, once those that are in the tryout section of the exam, it becomes pretty obvious to an existing student that these are brand new item types. They haven't been trained on how to answer them. Probably the data may be suspect. So the idea of how to handle item types within a test blueprint is certainly uncharted territory, and there's lots of ways that you might choose to do it. Some are better than others. Anyway, so the idea of using item styles and picking the items with the best information are competing priorities, probably at least at the start, and to assure that people have the same relative picture of the exam from an item style perspective, I think is important depending on the setting. For sure in licensing and certification tests, from a face validity standpoint, you can't have somebody having all constructed response and the next guy having all essay and the next guy having all multiple choice, despite the fact that they're all measuring the same construct. You're inviting criticism and comment in a place that doesn't really require it.
Tony, one of the things we run into in educational testing is that, probably in certain licensure testing too, is the idea of getting people up to speed on new item styles. I know of folks who have introduced item styles like instead of traditional multiple choice, they have multiple choice, but there are multiple answers that are correct or multiple steps that you have to choose in order to get the correct answer. And in a lot of cases, figuring out how to introduce the instruction associated with the new item types also gives us a little bit of worry, because if you introduce the instruction on the new item styles prior to the assessment, and then the individual doesn't actually see any of the new items, you've kind of wasted their time. On the other hand, if you introduce the instruction kind of on the fly, so that as an item is chosen, if it's answer all that apply, you give the person a little instruction on answer all that apply, then you've taken away some of their testing time. And it might differ depending on which individual is taking the test. Does that make sense?
It does. And
Yeah.
One of the things that we should be constantly aware of is the rarest element in a testing interaction is the student's interaction with the test. So that piece of magic that occurs when a student is in front of a test is the most rare interaction in everything that we do. And we need to maximize and be aware of students' time and treat it with the respect that it deserves. Okay, given the fact that computerized adaptive testing has introduced a bunch of ancillary needs and topics that need to be specifically addressed, and by not addressing them, you're addressing them in kind of an ad hoc way. We thought about describing an approach to looking at these competing priorities in a systems way, and I'm going to hand it off to Gage at this point. And then the thing that we need to do to hit home, and you'll let us know if we've done it or not, or we've described a set of constraints and problems with adaptive testing that big programs are kind of handling today. So what's the advantage of looking at this in an integrated systems approach? And Gage is going to discuss that now.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about the problem. Right now we have a system in which we have a series of side tools that we use to help deal with constraints that aren't necessarily included in the blueprint. I use the word constraints because we have a couple really good tools for dealing with systems that have multiple constraints. We have, for instance, a shadow test would allow you to deal with a huge number of constraints at the same time and do an extremely good job of identifying from the item pool available which items should be delivered to an individual. And you can do that sequentially, of course, so that it becomes a shadow adaptive test. There are other approaches that have been suggested to deal with a large number of constraints. One of the difficulties with the approaches that we currently have is the setting of priorities. One of the things that Tony mentioned a couple times in his conversation was that the side tools may not integrate particularly well. So for instance, if you have a need for continuous publishing of items and you have a need for item exposure control, you can't easily use the Simpson header approach because it requires pre-simulations. There are 1,000 other examples, and you could probably pick out good examples from your own experience. And if we have some time at the end, maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. But for right now, let's just say that there are a lot of places where it would be useful to have stakeholders set priorities concerning which of the aspects of an adaptive test they value the most, which they value the next most, which they value the least. So if you are running short on items in a particular content area, but the blueprint says you must give a certain number of items in that content area, what constraint goes away? What constraint is loosened in order to allow that to happen? Some testing programs use time-based constraints. An individual can't see a particular item within 2 years or 18 months if you're doing continuous testing of the same individuals. Is that as an important constraint as having the right number of items from each area of content? Okay. Let's talk about what a system approach might include. If we consider all of the aspects of the test setting and how they might interact, we might be able to use metadata that comes to us from those aspects of the test setting to allow priorities to be controlled. Okay? That presupposes that you set priorities, and it presupposes that you set priorities prior to administering tests. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Did I leave anything out, Tony? Feel free to jump in.
I will.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk about what a testing system commonly includes. It includes a set of items that might be stable, might be dynamic. It includes a set of test takers who also might be stable or dynamic. It includes a set of groups. Commonly within your set of test takers, if you're doing a large-scale adaptive test, there are smaller groups of individuals taking the test that might be important to consider. For instance, if you're giving a test that's a licensure test, the information about what school those individuals, those candidates came from might be useful. Similarly, in education, knowing important things like what grade the student is in, what school and possibly school district, if you have those, the individual comes from, could be useful. There are test events, an individual taking a test, and there are test elements. The test elements include the ones that Tony has mentioned. How do you deal with individuals who run out of time? How do you deal with item exposure? Any number of other elements. So let's talk a little bit more about what a systems-based approach might need. Let's say that you're trying to give an adaptive test and use a systems-based approach. You might want item data, both permanent and ephemeral. Permanent aspect of the item data might be what content area it's associated with it. An ephemeral piece of information about items might be how often they have been used. So giving the test access to those pieces of information kind of brings the system a little closer together. Another example would be, what's the average response time for this particular item? And that can be used in a couple different ways in a systems-based approach. We'll talk about those as we go along. Similarly, test taker metadata is important to have access to. What items has this individual seen today? What items has this individual seen in the past? Other aspects of the individual, what groups does this individual belong to, might be useful in identifying what kinds of items to give. So that gives you an idea of the kinds of metadata that are and are not available to your adaptive tests commonly. And what we'd like to see is having more of that information available to the test at runtime. So an individual who is taking the test in an environment, in a system, in which the system knows how often items have been administered. Because if you know how often items have been administered, that makes item exposure control a lot easier. You still have to do a lot of statistical analysis to identify how the items will be chosen, but just having the data available makes it a lot easier to do in an ongoing operational testing program. Okay, having said that, we're going to introduce Tony's name, which is dynamic computerized adaptive testing, which is an idea of how a systems-based approach might work. I'm a very old researcher. I have no good ideas. You are very young researchers. You have good ideas. You might also have graduate students. That might be helpful too. So we're gonna give you an idea of how this might work, and hopefully somebody sitting in the audience will take it and run with it and make it work. So let's talk about what a dynamic adaptive testing system might look like. First, we need predetermined weighting of blueprint elements. And when we talk about blueprints now, we're talking about an expanded blueprint from the one that Tony showed. And I'll give you an example of a piece of one of these expanded blueprints in just a little bit. But each blueprint element will receive a weighting based on its importance to stakeholders. So consider a standard setting activity. Now consider that instead of those stakeholders working on whether an individual is proficient or not proficient, those individuals are working on identifying which of the tools, which of the aspects of your adaptive test, which of the aspects of the system are going to take priority and what that priority is going to be. So I just added a huge layer to what we've been doing to create an adaptive test, but I think it's a useful layer. As Tony mentioned, in certification and licensure, a lot of times the test plan is a legal document all the time.
All the time, yeah.
All the time, a test plan is a legal document. And so you may get in trouble if you don't do something that's in the test plan. So if we have the stakeholders involved from the beginning in setting the priorities, we don't have to worry. Well, we do have to worry. We have to worry about making sure that all of our systems act together. But we at least have the confidence that our stakeholders have identified the priorities for us. And so then when an individual is running out of time, we know what the stakeholders have prioritized. We may still have to set some rules of thumb, but we know what the stakeholders have prioritized. Okay. The second aspect of a systems-based approach would be dynamic weighting of items. So each of the items in our item pool has a weighting associated with it. Right now, we use Fisher information, or we use KL information, we use some nice thing at the current achievement level estimate. So now consider that kind of weighting, but including the other aspects of the test plan. So rather than just including information, we're now including other aspects of the test plan.
Okay.
And those weightings, they're going to be dynamic because some of the metadata is ephemeral. If the individual taking the test now just took a particular item, the weighting for that item should go to 0. It should never be administered again to that individual at that time, unless you have a particularly interesting blueprint, in which case, knock yourself out. Okay. The last thing that we're suggesting being an aspect of the systems-based adaptive test, this dynamic CAT, is smart items. Right now, our items kind of sit there, and they have one capability. Well, they have two capabilities, actually. They have the capability of being administered, and they have the capability of being scored. And that's kind of all they do. There's metadata around them that controls whether they are administered to a particular person using a side tool to identify that. But the items themselves don't take any active part in the assessment. So what we're going to suggest is the addition of some aspects, some properties to the items themselves. So for instance, in a dynamic CAT, an item will be able to listen. And by listening, I mean it will be able to identify incoming metadata from a particular test event, to identify what's been given already in the test event and what is needed to fulfill the test plan, the test blueprint. It will be able to volunteer. So an item can say, administer me. It will be able to sit out. So if for some reason we've decided that an item shouldn't be administered in a particular location because it's been inadvertently exposed, it can sit out. And that's the choice of the item to do that. And finally, we've suggested that it can decide whether it's a field test item or not. If you have a really nice publishing system in which you're delivering tests dynamically, adding items dynamically, then you're probably feeding items into the field test process, and they are coming out of the field test process at different times. They might be. So the ability of an item to change from a field test item to an operational item in this structure becomes a function of the item, a characteristic of the item. Okay. What haven't I explained there, Tony?
That's the main thing. How would this work exactly, Gage? How does the
Okay.
item get smarter?
Okay. There are a couple ways of approaching having smarter items. One of which is to use like object-oriented programming, where every object in the program has a set of aspects, and those aspects are used to decide when something is done, how it is done, and what the outcome is. So if we consider that for an adaptive test, we might be able to use incoming and existing metadata to trigger actions, and you trigger actions in every item. The nice thing about the approach is that if it works well, it should be fairly efficient. Because each item is making a simple decision. They are deciding whether they are a candidate for administration. They are deciding whether they are a good candidate for administration. And let me show you a little bit about how that might be done. Let's go back to this idea of an extended blueprint. And let's say in our extended blueprint, we want to choose less used items more. And so we give that a set of weights initially, and the weights are 0.5 if it's an overused item, 1 if it's an average used item, and 50 if it's a little used item. So we give higher weight to an item that is little used. Okay. We want items to be taken from the less used content strands. So if we have a balanced content blueprint, we want the items to appear, the next item to be chosen commonly from a less used item plan. Okay. You get the idea. So we set up a series of weights associated with aspects of what we want the test to do. And then the item itself sees these weights and sees the metadata from the test event and the metadata that is associated with itself. And it decides, I am a moderately used item. I provide information of a certain amount at the current achievement level estimate for the individual. I'm from an underrepresented content strand. And so what we've done initially is done a simple serial product of the weights. So at the end of the serial product, every item has given itself a weight. And if the weight is above a certain threshold, the item decides it should be administered, which gives you several items that might choose to be administered at any time during the test. And so then you just figure out which of those either has the highest weight, or you select randomly among the ones that are reasonable for administration. Kind of like this. You start off with these unweighted items. We don't know what item to administer. The items don't know whether they should be administered. We apply the weights. Some of the items get higher weights. Some of the items get lower weights. Some of the items exceed a threshold for saying, administer me. And at that point, all of those items hold up their hand and they say, I want to be administered to this individual at this time. And then you have one process that decides which of those will be administered. It's a very straightforward process. I'm fairly certain that somebody can come up with a better process than the one that Tony and I have. But this is a good starting point. It's a good starting point. And it'd be fun to do some simulation work to see how it compares to other approaches. And with that, we've gotten to our conclusions. Not any too early. And so, Tony, would you like to help me with the conclusions here?
Sure. The conclusions are pretty straightforward, given what we've said so far. The traditional blueprint made a lot of sense with paper tests. It was useful for both educational and licensure certification applications. It gave us a roadmap for how to give students the right test at the right time. With adaptive tests, we've discussed there's a lot of other elements that are important, and the traditional content area-based blueprint is probably obsolete and not sufficient for controlling adaptive tests. A systems approach like DCAT, I think, will allow a more considered approach to the constraints required for operational adaptive test programs. And as Gage said, we're throwing this out as a thought experiment, an idea for all of you smart people to think about if you're interested, and provide input and work towards making it a reality. Because it seems to me, again, in a lot of the research that we talk about, operational testing programs oftentimes get less attention than the theoretical problems of the system.
Yeah.
And
And so the big finale, what we'd like to do is suggest that a systems-based approach might go beyond what we currently have. So for instance, if you want to include multiple IRT models in the same adaptive test, or if you want to control time and information so that an individual taking a test, you can say we want them to finish this test in approximately an hour. And you can control that with a systems-based approach much better than with the side tools that we currently have available. Right now, there's a lot of work being done with asynchronous scoring. I take a constructed response item, that item goes away, and so it's not available immediately to change my theta estimate, but it will be available in 20 seconds, or it will be available in half an hour, or it will be available by the next time. So the idea of having asynchronous scoring is quite useful. Anyway, these are just a few examples of things where we think a systems-based approach might move us a little bit further forward. And with that, we'll thank you for listening.
We'll probably have time for 0 questions, but we'll take a couple anyway if you have any. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So, and there's only one slide, and that's it. So, but I do have a 6-point program that I'm going to go over and go through. As we're getting into this, the first thing I actually want to do is I really want to go over and thank Tetsuo and his wife Fuji and his whole group of people who have been working on this. They've done an absolutely wonderful job, and as well as the sponsors who have supported the meeting and the planning committee. If you haven't looked at it, on page 5 in the printed booklet is the planning committee for this document. I'm not going to go down and read all their names and everything else because it's going to take too much time. But I'd like you to go over and give a nice applause to all the people who have been working here, because it's been really a wonderful meeting. And just a little bit about the meeting. We had 145 persons who attended overall, and they came from 18 different countries, so which is quite impressive. The countries with the most people coming were from the U.S., Japan, of course, which we would hope, but Korea, China, and the Netherlands. The Netherlands is always overrepresented for the size of their country. I don't know what this is about. There must be something in the water in the Netherlands that makes people come to psychometric meetings. I was a little bit surprised. We were sort of what I thought was a little underrepresented by, let's say, Australia or the Philippines or some of the other people out in this part of the world. But over about half of the attendees of this meeting came from this quarter of the world. If you slice the world into quarters, and this quarter of the Pacific Rim and the eastern part of the Pacific was about half of the attendees, and I think that's really good. It's exactly why we want to have meetings like this moved around the world, so we can get the good representation of people coming from other places. So this was, I think, really wonderful, and I really want to say that this is a good reason for trying to move this to different places and get other people involved. I also hope that you all, I was thinking about this, we should all give you all awards for being here now, and maybe we can give you something, a bunch of Kit Kat bars, these special ones from Japan, so that you would tell everybody who has already left that they missed out on something absolutely wonderful and that they should have stayed all the way to the end. So, but we are going to do something wonderful here to go over and make it worthwhile for you to be here. Okay, right now I would like actually for Gage, Kingsbury, and Theo to come on up here. Just, you know, this is a surprise. I think it's a surprise. I don't know if they know about this or not, but, you know, to come on up. I would have asked John to come up here too, but John left already, so he's out of luck. You know, this is kind of, if you come up early, you get a reward, you know, kind of, so, you know, just, Now, you know, John, I want to say a few things about. He did a fantastic job on doing an awful lot of work for this meeting. But the reason I wanted Gage and Theo to come up here is they are past presidents of the organization, and they're here too, and they've been functioning in this organization for a long time. So we have some gifts for them. There is this one is for Gage. Yeah. These are, and this one's for Theo. We also have more important gifts.
Wow.
Bottle of But and we have these for John as well, you know, and this is to show appreciation for all the things that you've done for the organization over the years, and we'll somehow have to ship John's his so that he, you know, because we wanted this to be a surprise. We should have warned him in advance so that he would be here. But so thank you very much. Now, one thing I want to add to this, I want to thank, even in absentia, David Weiss for sort of founding this organization. And I went to a meeting in 1977. So I don't know, I should have, how many people were born then? Okay, don't say that. But in 1977, there was a meeting, it was a second meeting on CAT, and it was actually called the Second Invitational Conference on Adaptive Testing, and it was hosted in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and David Weiss was the host of that meeting, and I consider that as the sort of the forerunner of this one, and so you can think about this right now. This is 40 years of having meetings and work on adaptive testing since that meeting. And it's because of that meeting that we wanted actually to honor David Weiss here at this meeting for that purpose, but we couldn't arrange it. We were going to get him on a big screen up here, you know, kind of, because he doesn't want to travel all that much, and we'd see his big, you know, and he could, but it didn't work out. So that's why we are going to be having the next meeting in Minneapolis in 2019 it'll be 42 years in honoring him, but to go over and have a special session of that meeting. So we want you to tell all of your colleagues and friends and everything else that we're going to have a special, you know, anniversary meeting of this organization to honor David Weiss for starting it, you know, for putting in a lot of effort in it over the years. So watch for this. It's already up actually on the website for the IACAT website to say it'll be in June in 2019 in Minneapolis, but the actual locations and the specific dates are not yet set. We're starting to work on the arrangements already for that meeting. And so tell everybody you know, tell them it's a wonderful thing. And if you come at the end of the meeting and stick around till the wrap up and closing, we'll have some special gift for everybody who shows up. So it's, no, we won't. Or maybe, we'll ask Dave. He'll give you back old issues of APM that he's got stored in his closet or something like that to go over and give as a gift for appearing. Okay, so those are the first two things on my agenda. There's only 6, so we'll be done fairly soon. The 2021 meeting is already on the horizon. We've already thought about this. And Alina Vandavier is, there she is in the back, has volunteered, actually, or appointed, I'm not sure if she was volunteered or appointed, to begin thinking about the organization and location of that meeting. So these meetings, I was going to say, these meetings take a lot of work, but they actually are a lot of gain. I'm going to, you know, I really appreciate all the work that Sue has done to go over and organize this meeting and all the people that are there. But I want to say that there's also huge amounts of benefits that you get from this. I don't know if it's true, but I want to say that. It's that, you know, you get to meet a lot of people, you do gain a lot of things, and then after the meeting is over, you feel so relieved that it makes everything else feel much better. So it's, but I don't want to scare people away. If you are interested in hosting that meeting, talk to Alina, and you really have to be serious about this, that we want to go over and have a really great meeting. But we have some ideas about places already, but we want to go over and make this available for people to host if you're really interested in doing it. And I think it is an enriching experience. I've hosted meetings before. During the meeting, I'm always saying, wow, this was a lot of work. Why did I agree to this? But after the meeting and everything else, I always say, well, that was really interesting and fun, and I'm glad we did it, and I hope that everybody came and enjoyed it. And it's a way of highlighting your own local region and, the things that are being done around where you are. And so I think you should, consider it if you think you have the capabilities to host this kind of a meeting. We're trying to keep the meeting size between about 100 and 150 people. I think that's perfect. I like the idea of being able to interact with a lot of people and getting to know a lot of new people. And if the meeting size is about that size, it's possible to go over and do that. So I'd love this to be more successful and everything else, but then I'd be scared if it got too many people, and then I wouldn't be able to have the kind of interactions with people that we have had this time. Alina is also the new vice president, so she will, in 2021, be the president. This is you get a long term of office. You're going to be involved for a long time. But so she is going to be the person who will be taking over after the next meeting in Minneapolis. Will be her responsibility. And I do encourage all of you to consider, especially since you're still here now, getting involved in service in the organization. This is a very much voluntary, this group and the people who are here, we make this organization, and it's all the people who are interested in this are the ones that make it all happen. So, if you're interested, let us know. We'll be glad to get you involved. There's most of the work of this organization is done interactively through email and other kind of messaging kind of things. So it's not a big burden in that way. But I think in the planning of this meeting, I think I have about 1,000 emails that I've saved, just so I can go back and look at this later on to help organize the next meeting and make sure I don't miss anything. So, but if you are interested in talk to Alina, and we'll, try to get you involved as much as possible. Another thing that's going to be coming to you is we're going to send out a survey to ask you what you thought of this particular meeting. Now, what we're going to do is, if you don't respond to the survey, we're going to assume that means that you thought that is absolutely wonderful, and that there's absolutely nothing wrong, and there's nothing that you would change to make it any better. So a non-response is going to be interpreted in that way. So we would hope that you'll respond. And the things that in particular, and we're interested in finding out about is, what do you think about the length of the meeting, 3.5 days? Is that the right length? Should it be shorter? Should it be longer? Do you like the mix of topics that we had? Would you like to see debates? Would you like to see other kinds of things going on? Do you like the kinds of activities we had here? I personally thought they were wonderful and really enjoyed those. What kind of things that you'd look for? We're trying to think of interesting things for Minneapolis, St. Paul when the meeting is there. We thought about taking everybody square dancing. No, we actually been thinking about boat trips because Minnesota is the land of 10,000 lakes. And so there are an awful lot of lakes, and then so we could go over and we can see how many of them we can go and visit while we're there. But we'll work on this to make it entertaining. The other thing about the facilities, I think these facilities have been wonderful. I actually love this room. I think it's really a fantastic room to go over and present in. So it's really nice. Travel requirements about how much lead time you need to know about the meeting in order to make sure you can get funding and make arrangements, and so that it doesn't cost you too much. So think about all of those things, and when you get the survey, if you have advice for us, send it. So it's a part of what will make the next meeting better, and we'll try to improve things overall. Okay, and finally, as I say, I want to thank all of you, because the meeting isn't anything unless people come and show up, and especially all of you who stayed around to the very end. So I want to thank you for that. And please go back to your institutions and your countries and inform other people about this group, because I do think that even though we know a lot about it, I was checking with people who go to the NCME meeting in the U.S., the National Council of Measurement Education, and I was sending them emails to tell them about this meeting. And there were quite a few people who presented papers on adaptive testing at the NCME meeting who were not aware of this one. And so I'm sure that there are a lot of people around the world that, we'd like to say everybody knows about this, but they don't. So help us to go out and inform individuals, about this meeting so that, the next one we can, have people who want to and who, can have things to say that will be, will submit papers, or they'll let us know that they're interested in a symposium or some other kind of format, and then we'll use that to go over and develop the program. So with that, unless people have comments from the audience, I know folks, a number are interested in getting to other places, either vacationing or holiday or trying to get home. So that's the major points I had over here. I think it's been an absolutely wonderful meeting, and I'm glad I've been here. And I want to again thank our organizer for doing a wonderful job in setting all this up. Do you have anything you want to say, or is it okay? Okay, then we are officially adjourned.